The water was cold that July morning in 1995, but I remember thinking it felt like a baptism into something pure, something true, something that would finally give my chaotic life meaning. I was 27 years old, standing in a hotel swimming pool in Manchester with 200 other believers watching, and when Brother Stevens pushed me under that chlorinated water, I believed with every fiber of my being that I was making the best decision of my life. I had no idea I was signing away the next 28 years to an organization that would eventually take everything from me, my family, my friends, my sense of self, and nearly my will to live. They don't tell you at the door when they first arrive with their leather book bags and their warm smiles that leaving will cost you everyone you've ever loved. They don't mention during those pleasant Tuesday evening Bible studies in your living room that questioning even one teaching will brand you as spiritually weak, possibly even apostate. They certainly don't explain while you're preparing for baptism that your children will one day be instructed to treat you as if you're dead if you ever decide this isn't the truth after all. I'm 55 now, and I've been out for nearly 3 years. My daughter hasn't spoken to me in all that time. My son sends me a birthday card each year but never includes a return address because his wife, still fully in, won't allow contact. The friends I spent decades with, the women I cried with, laughed with, went door to door with in the scorching summer heat and the bitter winter cold, they cross the street when they see me in town. But I'm free now, and that freedom came at a price so steep I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night wondering if I made the right choice. Then I remember what it felt like to live a lie, to smile and nod and pretend I believed things I knew in my gut were wrong, and I know I could never go back. This is my story, and if even one person reads it and thinks twice before walking into a kingdom hall for the first time, then sharing these painful memories will have been worth it. Before I dive into the details of how I got involved with Jehovah's Witnesses and what my life became over those nearly 3 decades, I want to ask you for a small favor. If this story resonates with you, if you know someone who's been through something similar, or if you're just curious about what really happens behind the closed doors of those kingdom halls you pass on your way to work, please hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be told, and they need to be heard by as many people as possible. Go ahead and give this video a thumbs up if you appreciate hearing real experiences from real people, not the sanitized version the organization presents to the public. And please drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. How many people around the world are either going through this or know someone who is. I also want to hear from you if you have your own experiences with high-control religious groups. You're not alone, even though they make you feel like you are when you finally walk away. The isolation is part of how they keep people trapped inside. When I left, I thought I was the only person in the world who had ever felt this way, who had ever questioned, who had ever looked around at a kingdom hall full of people and thought something is very wrong here. I wasn't, and if you're watching this feeling that way right now, neither are you. My name is Patricia, though I went by Pat for most of my adult life until I left the organization and decided to reclaim the full name my mother gave me. I grew up in Liverpool in the 1970s and 80s in a working-class family that had no religion to speak of. My dad worked at the docks until the industry collapsed, and my mum cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either, and I learned early that life was hard and you had to work for everything you got. I had my first daughter, Natalie, when I was 21, and I wasn't married to her father. He left before she was born, and I found myself alone, working 2 jobs, living in a tiny flat with damp creeping up the walls, and wondering if this was all there was to life. I was exhausted, lonely, and searching for something, anything, that would make sense of the struggle. That's when they knocked on my door. The knock came on a Saturday morning in March of 1993, and I almost didn't answer because I was still in my dressing gown with my hair unbrushed, and Natalie was watching cartoons on the floor surrounded by cereal she'd spilled. But something made me open that door, maybe just the desperate hope that it was someone, anyone, offering a bit of human connection in what had become an incredibly isolated existence. Standing there were 2 women, both probably in their 40s, both dressed neatly in skirts and blouses with cardigans despite the chill, both smiling at me like I was the person they'd been hoping to find all morning. The older one introduced herself as Sister Patricia Bennett, and I remember thinking it was odd that we shared a first name like it was some kind of sign. The younger one was Sister Caroline Shaw, and she had this warm, gentle voice that made you want to trust her immediately. They didn't launch into a religious pitch right away, which surprised me. Instead, Sister Bennett asked if I had a moment to chat about how difficult it was to raise children in today's world, and suddenly I was pouring out my heart to these two complete strangers on my doorstep about how scared I was that I couldn't give Natalie everything she needed, how worried I was about the violence on television, how overwhelmed I felt trying to do it all alone. They listened, really listened, in a way that no one had listened to me in years. Sister Caroline told me she'd been a single mother too before she found the truth, and she understood exactly what I was going through. They offered to come back the following week to share some Bible verses that had helped Sister Caroline during her difficult time, and I agreed without really thinking about what I was agreeing to. I just wanted to see them again, to have that feeling of being heard and cared about, even if it was from strangers selling something I didn't fully understand yet. The following Tuesday evening, they showed up exactly when they said they would, and that consistency was like water to someone dying of thirst. In my life up to that point, people said they'd do things and then didn't show up, didn't call, disappeared without explanation. But these women kept their word, and we sat at my kitchen table while Natalie colored in the next room, and they opened their Bibles and showed me scriptures about God's love and His plan for the earth. They showed me Revelation chapter 21 verses 3 and 4, about how God would wipe away every tear and there would be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. I had never been religious, had never really thought much about God except in a vague, disinterested way, but sitting there in my cramped kitchen with these kind women telling me there was hope for something better, I wanted to believe it so badly it physically ached. They weren't pushy, they didn't demand anything from me. They just kept coming back week after week. And slowly I started to think maybe this was what I'd been missing all along. Maybe the reason my life felt so empty and purposeless was because I didn't have Jehovah in it. Looking back now with the clarity that only distance can provide, I can see exactly what was happening. I was vulnerable, isolated, exhausted, and desperate for community and purpose. They were trained to recognize that vulnerability and to offer exactly what I needed, a ready-made family, a clear set of rules to follow, and the promise that if I did everything right, paradise was waiting just around the corner. But I didn't see it then. All I saw were two women who seemed genuinely interested in my well-being, who brought me magazines to read, and who started inviting me to meetings at the Kingdom Hall. My first meeting was overwhelming in the best possible way. Everyone was so friendly, so welcoming, so interested in meeting the new person Sister Bennett and Sister Caroline had been studying with. People introduced themselves, shook my hand, told me how wonderful it was that I was searching for the truth. An older sister named Brenda offered to watch Natalie during the meetings so I could concentrate, and I nearly cried at the kindness of it. I had been doing everything alone for so long that having a whole room full of people suddenly interested in helping me felt like I'd finally come home. The meetings themselves were unlike anything I'd experienced. There was singing from the songbook, though the songs were a bit strange and formal compared to what I'd heard in the few church services I'd attended as a child. There were talks given from the platform by brothers in suits, and they spoke with such authority and confidence about the Bible that I assumed they must have spent years studying in seminary or something. I didn't know then that most of them were window washers and janitors who'd been appointed by other window washers and janitors, with no formal theological training whatsoever. Everyone had a Bible, and they all flipped to the scriptures so quickly when the speaker referenced them, their fingers knowing exactly where to go. I fumbled with the Bible Sister Bennett had given me, trying to find the books, trying to keep up, feeling inadequate but also strangely excited to learn this new skill. The Watchtower study was the strangest part, where everyone read paragraphs from the magazine and then people raised their hands to answer pre-written questions by basically repeating what they just read. I didn't understand why we couldn't just read the magazine at home, but everyone seemed so enthusiastic about it that I figured there must be something I was missing. After the meeting, people invited me to go out for coffee with them, and we sat in a cafe on Bold Street while they talked about the things they'd learned and how blessed we all were to have the truth. They spoke about people who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses with a mixture of pity and slight disdain, calling them worldly people who were blinded by Satan. I felt uncomfortable with that language, but I pushed the discomfort down because these people had been so kind to me, and surely they knew better than I did. I was still learning, still trying to understand, and I didn't want to seem ungrateful or spiritually weak by questioning anything so early on. Within 6 months, my entire life revolved around the Kingdom Hall. I attended meetings 3 times a week, Tuesday and Thursday evenings plus Sunday mornings. And I went out in field service every Saturday morning and often one weekday afternoon as well. Sister Bennett and Sister Caroline continued my home Bible study every Tuesday before the evening meeting, and we worked through the book they used at that time called Knowledge That Leads to Everlasting Life. Every chapter had questions at the bottom of the page, and I'd underline the answers in the paragraphs above and then recite them back when they asked, proving I'd understood the material. The studying was actually comforting in a strange way because everything was so clear and definite. There was never any ambiguity, never any maybe or perhaps or different people interpret this differently. The organization had figured out exactly what every scripture meant, and my job was simply to learn what they'd already determined was true. It was like following a recipe: measure out these beliefs, mix them with these behaviors, bake at regular meeting attendance, and the result would be salvation when Armageddon came. And Armageddon was coming soon. They assured me of that constantly. We were living in the last days, and all the signs were there if you knew how to read them. Wars, earthquakes, food shortages, the decline of morals in society, all of it pointed to the fact that this system of things was about to end. The organization had been saying this since the late 1800s, but I didn't know that then. I thought the urgency I heard in every talk, the constant pressure to do more in field service because time was running out, was because we truly were on the brink of the end. I started making changes in my life to align with what I was learning. I threw away all my music that had anything to do with sex or drugs or violence, which meant most of my collection ended up in the bin. I stopped watching certain television programs because they showed things Jehovah disapproved of. I cut off contact with my cousin Jenny because she'd recently come out as a lesbian, and I'd been taught that homosexuality was an abomination and that I needed to maintain my spiritual cleanliness by not associating with people who practiced that lifestyle. Jenny tried to talk to me, tried to understand why I was suddenly treating her like she had a contagious disease, but I was firm in my new beliefs and I told her I couldn't spend time with her unless she changed. The memory of that conversation haunts me now. Jenny died 5 years ago in a car accident, and we'd never reconciled. I threw away a relationship with someone I'd grown up with, someone who'd been there for me when Natalie was born and her father left, and I did it because a group of men in Brooklyn who'd never met either of us had decided they knew better than I did about who deserved my love and loyalty. But at the time I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was putting Jehovah first, and that meant everything else, even family, came second. My romantic life became non-existent because dating as a Jehovah's Witness was a complicated minefield of rules. You could only date someone who was also a baptized witness, and you could only date if your intention was marriage. Casual dating was considered wrong, and you certainly couldn't date multiple people to figure out who might be a good match. You found someone in the congregation who was baptized and in good standing. You maybe talked to them briefly after meetings with other people around as chaperones, and if you decided you wanted to pursue marriage, you asked for permission from the elders to officially court. I didn't think I'd ever marry again, honestly, because the single brothers in my congregation were either decades older than me or clearly had no interest in a woman who came with a child. But I convinced myself it didn't matter because the new system was coming so soon, and in paradise, we'd all be perfect and any loneliness I felt now would be erased. I threw myself into service to Jehovah instead, pioneering as soon as I could, which meant committing to 90 hours a month in field service on top of all the meeting attendance and personal study. Pioneering was presented as the highest calling for any witness who wasn't serving at Bethel or appointed as an elder. Regular publishers were expected to try for 10 hours a month in service, but pioneers were the truly spiritual ones, the ones who'd made their dedication to Jehovah their primary focus. I wanted so badly to be seen as spiritual, to be one of the sisters everyone looked up to, that I rearranged my entire work schedule to make pioneering possible. I switched to working night shifts at a care home so I could be available during the day for field service, and I survived on 4 or 5 hours of sleep most days. Natalie suffered for my devotion, though I couldn't see it at the time. She was 6 years old when I started studying, and by the time I was pioneering regularly, she was spending more time with Sister Brenda and other families in the congregation than she was with me. I'd drop her off before field service, pick her up just in time to feed her dinner and get ready for the evening meeting, then drop her with a babysitter while I went to the meeting. I thought I was giving her a spiritual heritage, surrounding her with good association, but what I was actually doing was teaching her that the organization was more important than she was. The pressure to get baptized intensified after I'd been studying for about 18 months. Sister Bennett started asking during our study sessions whether I'd thought about taking the next step, whether I was ready to dedicate my life to Jehovah. I was terrified, if I was honest, because baptism felt so permanent and so public. But I was also desperate to be fully accepted into the congregation, to stop being a Bible study and become a real sister. The unbaptized were always on the periphery, never quite fully included, and I wanted to belong completely. The organization had recently changed the baptism questions, and instead of dedicating yourself to God through Christ, you now also had to acknowledge that you were associating yourself with God's Spirit-directed organization. That second question should have been a massive red flag, should have made me ask why I needed to pledge loyalty to a publishing company in Brooklyn, but I was so fully indoctrinated by that point that it seemed completely reasonable. Of course you had to acknowledge the organization, because it was Jehovah's earthly channel of communication. To reject the organization was to reject Jehovah himself. I went through the baptism questions with 2 elders in a small room at the Kingdom Hall, and they asked me about my beliefs, about whether I'd given up any practices that Jehovah disapproved of, about whether I understood the seriousness of dedication. I answered everything correctly, having memorized what I was supposed to say, and they approved me for baptism at the next circuit assembly. I felt proud and terrified in equal measure, and I still believed with everything in me that I was doing the right thing. The assembly was held at a rented venue in Preston, and there were 43 of us getting baptized that day. We sat together in a special section, wearing clothes we didn't mind getting wet, and we listened to a talk about the seriousness of the step we were taking. The speaker emphasized that baptism wasn't the end of our dedication but the beginning, and that we needed to remain faithful until death or until Armageddon came, whichever happened first. He made it sound like the most important decision we'd ever make, which it was, though not in the way he meant. They asked us the 2 baptism questions from the platform, and we all answered yes in unison. The first question was about repentance and faith in Christ's sacrifice. The second question was whether we understood that our dedication and baptism identified us as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in association with God's Spirit-directed organization. That word organization should have stuck out to me, should have made me wonder why I was pledging myself to a corporation rather than just to God. But I was surrounded by hundreds of people who'd already made the same pledge, and the pressure to conform, to not be the one person who hesitated or questioned, was overwhelming. We lined up and walked down to the pool, and when it was my turn, Brother Stevens, who I barely knew, took my hand and my shoulder and pushed me backward into the water. It was over in seconds, and when I came up sputtering and wiping water from my eyes, everyone was clapping and I was officially one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I felt nothing, honestly, no profound spiritual experience, no sense of God's presence, just cold and wet and a bit embarrassed that my shirt was clinging to me inappropriately. But I smiled and acted like it was the best moment of my life because that's what everyone expected. Life after baptism was both easier and harder. It was easier because I was finally fully accepted, finally able to participate in everything without the asterisk of being unbaptized. But it was harder because the expectations increased dramatically. Now I was expected to comment at every meeting, to participate in the ministry school, to take return visits and try to start Bible studies of my own. The pressure was constant and exhausting, and I struggled with the feeling that I was never doing enough, never spiritual enough, never measuring up to the examples of the sisters who seemed to do it all effortlessly. The judgment within the congregation was subtle but pervasive. Sisters would make comments about other sisters who weren't pioneering, questioning their spirituality, wondering why they weren't doing more if they really loved Jehovah. Brothers who didn't reach out for privileges were considered spiritually weak, and their wives often bore the shame of their husbands' lack of ambition. Everyone was watching everyone else, measuring, comparing, finding each other lacking. It was exhausting trying to maintain the appearance of spiritual strength when inside I was falling apart from the pressure. Natalie was baptized when she was 12 years old, and I was so proud, so convinced that I'd done right by her in raising her in the truth. She'd been attending meetings her entire life at that point, and she knew all the right answers, could quote scriptures from memory, knew how to present herself as a good little witness girl. But she was 12, and 12-year-olds shouldn't be making lifelong binding commitments to organizations that will shun them if they later change their minds. I didn't see it then because I was too deep in it myself, but looking back, what we did to those children, what I did to my own daughter, was unconscionable. The years started to blur together into a routine of meetings and service and assemblies and conventions. There were bright spots, friends I genuinely cared about, moments of feeling like I was part of something bigger than myself, times when I could almost convince myself that the sacrifices were worth it. But there were also dark periods where I felt completely empty, going through the motions, saying the right things, maintaining the right appearance, while feeling absolutely nothing inside. I met Daniel at a convention when I was 34 years old, and he seemed like an answer to prayers I'd stopped praying. He was a ministerial servant in a congregation about 40 miles away, recently divorced after his wife had left the truth and run off with a worldly man. We were introduced by mutual friends who thought we might be a good match, and we started a carefully chaperoned courtship that involved long phone calls and occasional visits, always with other people present. The elders had to approve our courtship, asking us both separately about our intentions and our spiritual goals. They warned Daniel about taking on a woman with a teenage daughter, suggested he think carefully about whether he wanted that responsibility. They warned me about making sure I wasn't just desperate for a husband, that I was truly compatible with Daniel spiritually. We jumped through all their hoops, answered all their questions, and 8 months later we were married in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall. Marriage to Daniel was complicated from the start. He was kind but emotionally distant, more interested in his theocratic privileges than in building a real relationship with me. We attended all the meetings together, went out in service together, hosted the book study at our home for a while, and from the outside we looked like the perfect spiritual couple. But in private, there was a coldness between us that I couldn't quite name or address. He criticized the way I kept house, the way I interacted with Natalie, the way I conducted my Bible studies, and I learned to keep quiet and try harder to meet his standards. The sex was awkward and infrequent, and when I tried to talk to the elders' wives about feeling disconnected from my husband, they told me I needed to be more submissive, more supportive of his spiritual goals, more willing to meet his needs. The responsibility for the health of the marriage was placed entirely on my shoulders, and I carried that weight believing that if I could just be a better wife, more like the Proverbs 31 woman, then Daniel would warm up to me and we'd have the kind of marriage I saw other couples in the congregation claiming to have. The first real crack in my faith came when I was 41 years old and a teenage girl in our congregation attempted suicide. Her name was Sophie, and she was 16. And she'd been disfellowshipped 3 months earlier for having sex with her boyfriend. The elders had interrogated her about the details of what she'd done, where she'd done it, how many times, exactly what acts had occurred, and she'd sat in front of 3 middle-aged men and answered their questions while they took notes. Then they'd announced from the platform that she was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and her entire family, including her parents and her younger siblings, had stopped speaking to her even though she still lived at home. She tried to get reinstated, attending every meeting and sitting in the back row while everyone ignored her, writing letters to the elders begging for another chance, trying to prove she was repentant. But they decided she wasn't sufficiently sorry, that she needed more time to prove herself, and after 3 months of complete isolation while still being forced to attend meetings and watch everyone else interact and pretend she didn't exist, she took a bottle of pills from her mother's medicine cabinet. She survived, thankfully, but barely. The congregation's response was to blame her for being spiritually weak, for not having enough faith to endure discipline from Jehovah. Not one person, not the elders who disfellowshipped her, not the parents who'd shunned their own child under their own roof, took any responsibility for creating an environment so toxic that a 16-year-old girl would rather die than continue living in it. I sat in a meeting where an elder gave a talk about how disfellowshipping was a loving provision, and if people couldn't handle it, that was evidence they didn't really love Jehovah. I started noticing other things after that, things I'd been trained not to see. I noticed how many young people left as soon as they were old enough to escape their parents' control. I noticed how many marriages in the congregation were clearly miserable but staying together because divorce was only allowed for adultery. I noticed how the elders played favorites, how certain families got away with behavior that others would be disciplined for, How money and status within the congregation seemed to matter more than actual spirituality. I started doing something dangerous. I started researching the organization's history online. I'd been told my entire time as a witness that apostates spread lies on the internet, and that looking at anything critical of the organization was inviting Satan into my home. But Sophie's suicide attempt had shaken something loose in me, and I couldn't ignore the questions anymore. I waited until Daniel was out in service, and I locked myself in our spare room and started searching. What I found destroyed me. I learned that the organization had been predicting the end of the world since the 1880s and had gotten it wrong over and over again. I learned about 1914, which they claimed was the year Christ returned invisibly, and how they'd arrived at that date through a convoluted series of calculations that started with the fall of Jerusalem, which they dated to 607 BCE, even though every historian and archaeologist agreed it happened in 587 BCE. The whole chronology was built on a date they knew was wrong, but they couldn't admit it because their entire theological structure would collapse. I learned about 1925, when the organization had promised that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would be resurrected, and had even built a mansion in California called Beth Sarim for them to live in. I learned about 1975, when they'd heavily implied the end would come and tens of thousands of witnesses had sold their homes and quit their jobs in anticipation, only to be left devastated when nothing happened, and the organization blamed them for reading too much into suggestions that everyone had heard from the platform. I learned that they'd rewritten their own history, claiming they'd never made specific predictions when their old literature clearly showed they had. But the worst discovery was about the child abuse. I found case after case of children who'd been sexually abused by members of the congregation, who'd reported it to the elders, and who'd been told they needed a second witness to the abuse before anything could be done. Since sexual predators rarely abuse children in front of witnesses, this policy meant thousands of abusers had been allowed to continue attending meetings and going out in field service, often being moved to new congregations without the new congregation being warned. The organization had paid out millions in settlements while claiming in court that they had no duty to report abuse to the police because of clergy penitent privilege. I felt physically sick reading case after case of children whose lives had been destroyed because the organization prioritized its reputation over their safety. I thought about all the times I'd taken Natalie door to door, leaving her in cars with brothers I barely knew, trusting that because they were Jehovah's Witnesses they were safe. I thought about Sophie sitting in a room with 3 elders describing her sexual activity in detail, and I wondered how many men in positions of authority in the congregation were getting off on these interrogations while pretending it was spiritual discipline. Daniel found me crying at the computer, and when he asked what was wrong, I made the mistake of telling him. I showed him the Australian Royal Commission findings, the court cases, the documented evidence of the organization's cover-ups. I thought he'd be as horrified as I was, that we'd figure out together what to do with this information. Instead, he slammed the laptop closed and told me I was being influenced by apostates, that I was letting Satan use my emotions to lead me away from the truth. We had the worst fight of our marriage, with him insisting that even if some of what I'd found was true, it didn't matter because Jehovah would sort it out in his own time, and questioning the organization was questioning Jehovah himself. I tried to make him understand that protecting children should be more important than protecting the organization's reputation, but he was completely closed off, completely unable to hear what I was saying. He went to the elders the next day and told them I was looking at apostate material online. 2 elders showed up at our house that evening and sat me down for what they called a shepherding call, but what felt like an interrogation. They asked me what websites I'd been visiting, what doubts I was having, whether I was talking to anyone else about my concerns. I tried to be honest, tried to explain that I just wanted to understand how the organization could have policies that protected abusers, but they didn't want to hear it. They told me I needed to stop doing independent research, that I should only read literature published by the organization, and that if I continued down this path I could be labeled as an apostate myself. The word apostate was like a nuclear bomb in that conversation. It meant I could lose everything: my husband, my daughter who was now fully grown and pioneering herself, every friend I'd made over the previous 15 years. They didn't have to say it explicitly because the threat was understood. I could conform and keep my family and friends, or I could continue asking questions and lose everyone I loved. So I did what they wanted. I said I was sorry, said I'd been weak and had let my emotions overrule my faith, and I promised to stop looking at anything critical of the organization. For the next 11 years, I lived a double life. Outwardly, I was the perfect witness, attending all the meetings, going out in service regularly, commenting with the right answers, maintaining my friendships within the congregation. But inwardly, I was dying a little more each day, forcing myself to promote teachings I no longer believed, watching young people get baptized knowing they were trapping themselves in the same system that had trapped me, smiling and nodding while elders gave talks that I knew were built on lies and manipulation. I started to see the control mechanisms everywhere once I knew to look for them. The constant busy work that kept people too exhausted to think critically. Meetings 3 times a week plus service plus personal study plus family worship night plus convention preparation plus assembly parts. The information control that forbade looking at any sources outside the organization's approved material. The loaded language that made it impossible to discuss doubts without sounding like you were spiritually weak or worse. The fear of losing everyone you loved if you stepped out of line. I watched as my daughter Natalie married a brother who seemed nice enough, but who I could tell within months was controlling and emotionally abusive. She'd come over to my house with bruises she'd try to hide, and when I asked about them, she'd make excuses about being clumsy. When I suggested maybe she should talk to someone, maybe consider leaving if things were bad, she looked at me with genuine fear and said she couldn't get divorced unless he committed adultery, and if she left him without proper ground she'd be the one who got disfellowshipped. I felt helpless watching her stay in a marriage that was clearly harmful because the organization's rules left her no way out. I thought about going to the elders, but I knew from experience that they'd blame her, tell her she needed to be more submissive, suggest that if she was a better wife he wouldn't have any reason to be angry with her. The organization's teachings about headship and submission created perfect conditions for abuse, and there was nothing I could do to protect my daughter from a situation I'd helped push her into by raising her in this religion. Daniel and I barely spoke to each other by this point except to coordinate meeting attendance and field service. He'd been appointed as an elder, which meant even more time away from home for meetings and judicial committees and shepherding calls. I'd hear him on the phone counseling other couples about their marriages, and I'd want to laugh at the absurdity of him giving relationship advice when our own marriage was an empty shell. But that was normal in the organization, people pretending everything was fine while falling apart behind closed doors. The turning point came when I was 52 years old and sitting in a meeting where an elder was giving a talk about obedience to the faithful and discreet slave. He read the scripture from Matthew where Jesus asks who the faithful and wise servant is, and then he explained that this applied exclusively to the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, the 8 men in New York who directed the worldwide organization. He said that following their direction, even if it didn't make sense from a human standpoint, was the same as following direction from Jehovah himself. Something inside me snapped in that moment. I'd spent 24 years following the direction of men I'd never met, men who claimed to speak for God but who'd been wrong over and over again about major doctrinal points and predictions. I'd sacrificed relationships, opportunities, my own critical thinking abilities, all because these men said they were God's channel and I'd believed them. But sitting there listening to that elder insist that we should obey even when it didn't make sense, I realized I'd been in a cult this entire time and I couldn't do it anymore. I stopped attending meetings after that talk. I just stopped going, didn't make excuses, didn't try to fade gradually, just stopped. Daniel was furious, demanded to know what I was doing, threatened to move out if I didn't come to my senses. The elders started calling, wanting to arrange shepherding calls, but I refused to meet with them. I told them I was done, that I didn't believe the organization was God's channel, and that I wouldn't be returning. The elders told me that if I kept talking like that, if I expressed doubts to anyone else in the congregation, they'd have no choice but to disfellowship me for apostasy. I told them to do what they needed to do, that I wasn't afraid of their threats anymore. They scheduled a judicial committee, but I refused to attend. I sent them a letter formally disassociating myself from the organization, knowing it would have the same result as being disfellowshipped, but at least I'd have done it on my own terms. The announcement came the following week at the midweek meeting, though I wasn't there to hear it. Daniel told me about it later, how the elder had simply said that Patricia Collins was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and that was it. 28 years of my life reduced to a single sentence that gave no explanation, no context, nothing that would help people understand why someone who'd been so involved for so long would suddenly walk away. The organization doesn't want people to know the reasons others leave because those reasons might make people think, might make them question, might make them do their own research. Daniel moved out 3 days after the announcement. He said he couldn't live with an apostate, that it would damage his reputation as an elder and make it look like he condoned my decision. He filed for divorce citing my spiritual abandonment as grounds, and the elders approved it, telling him he was free to remarry as long as it was to someone in the truth. We'd been married for 18 years, but apparently my leaving the organization meant I'd broken our marriage vows. Never mind that those vows were supposed to be until death do us part, not until one of us stops believing the governing body speaks for God. The hardest part wasn't losing Daniel, honestly, because our marriage had been dead for years anyway. The hardest part was losing Natalie, my daughter who I'd carried for 9 months, who I'd raised and sacrificed for and loved more than anything else in this world, refused to take my calls after the announcement. I sent her texts begging her to at least hear me out, to let me explain why I'd left, but she blocked my number. I tried going to her house, but she wouldn't answer the door even though I could see her looking out the window at me. She finally sent me one message through Daniel's phone, and it said that I'd chosen my path and she'd chosen hers, that she couldn't associate with someone who'd turned their back on Jehovah, and that maybe when I came to my senses and repented I could contact her again, but until then she needed to protect her own spirituality. She was 27 years old, the same age I'd been when I got baptized, and the organization had taught her to cut her own mother out of her life without a second thought. I tried to reach out to friends I'd known for decades, women I'd pioneered with, gone to conventions with, cried with over the years. Every single one of them refused to speak to me. Some blocked me immediately. Others sent me messages saying they loved me but they had to be loyal to Jehovah's organization. One sister I'd been particularly close to told me she'd been warned by the elders that if she had any contact with me, she could be viewed as supporting apostasy herself and could face her own judicial committee. The isolation was crushing in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, even though I'd known it was coming. I'd spent 28 years building my entire social network within the organization, and overnight every single person in that network was gone. I had no worldly friends because I'd been taught to avoid close association with non-witnesses. I had no family outside the organization except for Jenny, who I'd shunned years earlier and who'd since passed away. I was utterly and completely alone in a way that made me understand why so many people who leave end up going back despite knowing it's not the truth. But I couldn't go back, not even to stop the pain of the isolation because I knew too much now. I knew about the false predictions and the covered-up abuse and the manipulative control tactics. I knew that the men in New York claiming to speak for God were just men, fallible and wrong about so many things, who'd built an empire on the backs of millions of people like me who'd given their time and money and energy believing they were serving God when really they were just serving a publishing corporation. I started attending a support group for people who'd left high-control religious groups, and that was the first time I felt like I could breathe. Hearing other people's stories, realizing I wasn't crazy or weak or spiritually deficient but that I'd been manipulated by a system designed to manipulate, was liberating in a way I can't fully describe. These people understood what I'd been through because they'd been through it too, maybe with Jehovah's Witnesses or maybe with Scientology or the LDS Church or any number of other groups that use the same tactics to control their members. I started therapy with someone who specialized in religious trauma, and slowly I began to rebuild a sense of self that wasn't tied to what an organization told me I should be. I had to relearn how to make decisions without consulting a committee of elders or searching for direction in Watchtower publications. I had to figure out what I actually believed versus what I'd been taught to believe. I had to learn how to trust my own judgment again after decades of being told that independent thinking was dangerous, and that I should rely on God's organization to do my thinking for me. The grief came in waves. I'd be fine for days or weeks, and then something would trigger a memory and I'd be sobbing on my kitchen floor mourning all the years I'd lost, all the relationships I'd destroyed in the name of truth that turned out to be lies. I grieved for my younger self who'd been so desperate for belonging that she'd walked into a trap without seeing it. I grieved for Natalie and all the young people still trapped in the organization who'd been robbed of normal childhoods. I grieved for Sophie and all the others who'd been damaged by the organization's cruel policies. But alongside the grief, there was also an emerging sense of freedom that I'd never experienced in my entire adult life. I could read whatever books I wanted without worrying if they were spiritually dangerous. I could watch whatever movies I wanted without checking if they had content Jehovah disapproved of. I could celebrate my birthday for the first time since I was 27, and when a coworker invited me to her Christmas party, I went and I had a wonderful time, and the sky didn't fall and God didn't strike me down for participating in a pagan holiday. I started dating someone I met through a friend from the support group, and he was kind and emotionally available in ways Daniel had never been. He listened when I talked about my trauma, didn't judge me for the years I'd spent in the organization, and helped me see that I deserved love that wasn't conditional on my beliefs or my obedience to a set of arbitrary rules. We took things slowly because I was still learning how to be in a relationship where I had equal say, where I wasn't expected to be submissive just because I was a woman, but it felt healthy in a way nothing in my life had felt healthy for decades. I'm 55 years old now, and I've been out of the organization for nearly 3 years. My daughter still won't speak to me, and I don't know if she ever will. That pain hasn't gotten easier, and I don't think it ever will. I miss her every single day, wonder what's happening in her life, wonder if she ever thinks about me or if the organization has successfully convinced her that I'm dead to her now. I send her a card every year on her birthday, even though I know she probably throws them away unopened, because I need her to know that I haven't given up on her, that when she's ready to leave or even just ask questions, I'll be here. The truth is that leaving cost me almost everything, and there are still days when the weight of what I lost feels unbearable. But staying would have cost me my integrity, my self-respect, and whatever years I have left on this earth. I couldn't spend the rest of my life promoting something I knew was harmful, couldn't keep pretending I believed things I discovered were false, couldn't keep watching people get hurt by policies I knew were wrong while saying nothing because speaking up would cost me my family. If you're reading this and you're currently one of Jehovah's Witnesses, or if you're studying with them, or if you're considering getting baptized, please do the research they tell you not to do. Look at the Australian Royal Commission findings. Read the court documents from the abuse cases. Look at their own old publications and see how many times they've been wrong about major doctrines and predictions. Look at the stories of people who've left and ask yourself why thousands upon thousands of people would walk away from everyone they love if it wasn't because they discovered something deeply wrong with the organization. Don't take my word for it or anyone else's word for it, but please look at the evidence before you make a commitment that will be almost impossible to undo without losing everyone you love. If it's really the truth, it should be able to withstand scrutiny. If looking at evidence that challenges the organization's claims makes you apostate, then maybe that should tell you something about whether you're really being encouraged to find truth or just obey without questioning. I was 27 when I entered that water in 1995, and if I'd known then what I know now at 55, I would have run in the opposite direction and never looked back.